I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics, and it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you here. We have this terrific program tonight. I can't remember when we've had more IQ per square foot here next to me, and so that's why I was really looking forward to this. Our rock star guest is Janet Brown, right next to me. Janet is the director of the Commission on Presidential Debates. She has had that job since there was the Commission on Presidential Debates beginning in 1988, and she has overseen every presidential debate since the commission took over the debates. She is a rock star. She's known all over the country, and we're lucky to have her here at Ole Miss. We'll hear more from her in a minute. We have, back by popular demand, Tom Oliphant. Tom and Curtis Wilkie, the person on his left, and anybody else I'd say it's appropriate for Curtis to be on his left, but it's a close call between Tom Oliphant and Curtis Wilkie about who ought to be on the left of whom. But Tom and Curtis work together at the Boston Globe. Tom's written many books on many subjects. What's the latest tally on the number of books you've written?
We're each 5, aren't we?
Yeah. Each 5. And their latest book they did write together. It's called The Road to Camelot. And they've been on programs all over the country about that book. Curtis, of course, is famous to everybody. You can't go downtown Oxford very fast if Curtis is with you, because everybody wants to stop and talk to Curtis. He was the original inaugural fellow, as I call him, at the Overby Center. And he, like Tom, has known Janet for a long, long time. Janet, your people are from Como, and that's really good to have a Mississippi connection. Could you briefly explain that Mississippi connection?
My maternal great-grandparents lived in Como, which is where my dad spent his summers as a little boy. And I sat on the board of a nonprofit in Chapel Hill for 21 years, whose chairman for most of those 21 years was William Winter. And Governor Winter, who is a major hero of mine, used to start every board meeting by looking at me pointedly and going, "And how are things in Como?" So it is a source of great pride for me to have people in Como. And it gave me instant credibility during the debate here when I could be introduced by people as saying, "And her people are from Como." So that's my legitimate claim to fame. If I'm a rock star, it's because I'm a rock star from Como.
Well, there's plenty of things to talk about, but I wanted to kind of start at the beginning. One, how do you get a job like this? And two, why did the powers that be decide to move from the League of Women Voters sponsoring this to this special new Commission on Presidential Debates?
I'll take those in reverse order and answer by saying that the League of Women Voters had sponsored the debates in 1976, 80, and 84 after a hiatus after the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates. The incumbents and challengers during that gap basically refused to debate. And since there had been no habit of debates, there wasn't an enormous amount of blowback from the press or the public. Comes 76, and you have the incredibly unusual situation of an incumbent president who had not been elected, Gerald Ford. And he is running against a relatively unfamiliar governor from Georgia. Both of them believed that they would be well served by the debates. The League of Women Voters stepped in to sponsor those debates, and they held the ones in 76 and 80 and 84. Following 84, there were 2 studies done, one at Georgetown University and one at Harvard, that actually looked at the growing importance of debates, their role in the general election. And they came to the conclusion that there should be one organization that was started that did nothing other than sponsor debates. The League actually represents candidates' positions on the issues. They take positions on issues and they do some lobbying. There was a sense that for an organization to do debates when they did anything else, that there was the potential for conflict. Both of these studies came to the conclusion that there should be an organization that did only debates. And steps were taken by the then sitting chairman of the Democratic National Committee and Republican National Committee to form the commission, which for all of our long wordy name is in fact a not-for-profit, nonpartisan corporation that's based in Washington, D.C. You're looking at half the staff, and the reason I got the job was, like most things in Washington, nothing but a happy accident. I'd been in government for about 15 years after college and graduate school, and I remember I was asked if I would submit my resume for this brand new organization, and I came home that night and I said to my husband, that sounds horrible. And he said, it may, but you need a job. And I said, good point. And I was lucky enough to be asked to be the executive director. I don't think we had much of an idea of how it was going to go forward in those early years. Another happy accident was deciding to do debates on campuses, because since the debates are about education, that seemed like a logical thing to do. We've gotten, which we can talk about later, heavily involved in helping emerging democracies start their own debates because they've watched ours and they think that they would be instrumental in building their own strong governments. So it's been an amazing evolution of a tiny little organization that thankfully has now got a track record thanks to not only our team of professionals, but working with teams like here at Ole Miss that was headed by two of my heroes who are in this room, Chancellor Robert Kayat and Andy Mullins, who led the effort here. And without them, it never would have happened.
Let's talk about the evolution of the debates. Used to be there were 3 or 4 reporters asking questions, and I think you've changed that to now you prefer really one moderator. Why did you make that change, and how do you think it's working?
We talk about debate arithmetic, and the fact is the more people you have on a stage, the more participants there are who will take up some time. It seemed to us to be a good idea to move the format towards one where the maximum time and attention are given to the candidates. So starting actually in our second series of debates in '92, we had one half of one debate be moderated by a single individual. And that is just, it's pulling other participants away. It's also allowing for a continuity by that individual who can be in charge of the whole debate and move things along in a way that is quite fluid. In the last 2 cycles, we've also gotten away from the shorter time limits with questions and answers in fairly small increments. In 2012, for the first time, we divided the presidential debates, not the town meeting debate, but the other ones, into 6 15-minute segments, each of which is on one topic. And the moderator not only selects the topics and announces them ahead of time, but then starts each of those 15-minute segments with an individual question, the candidates answer, and then the balance of the time is given to an exchange between the candidates. So in the first debate in 2012, first time we tried this, in the first 30 minutes, Jim Lehrer, our moderator, used 2. That, I think, is working towards something that is very much more effective about just focusing the time and attention on the candidates. From our perspective, it's working really well.
Curtis and Janet are co-teaching a class in the Honors College on the presidential debates. Curtis, what have you gleaned from your students about the major questions about the debates in general, or interest in Janet?
Well, the one I wanted to throw out tonight for Janet, and we've kicked it around in class already, I had them write a paper before Janet got here on the impact of television on these debates. And there was a general feeling that style triumphed over substance at these debates. And I think at least 4 of the 15 students in the class said, we should do away with televised presidential debates because the winner is the best actor, whether it's Ronald Reagan or a Bill Clinton is more effective. Donald Trump, TV personality, and Janet can and has already addressed it. Maybe it's a good time, Janet, to respond to that thought that we talked about again this morning of should we do away with debates as they are now constituted because they produce TV stars rather than political leaders?
You can't take the visual out of television, and as long as more people get their news from some kind of visual medium, whatever the screen is you're looking at, then I think you need to try to understand what is the best way to formulate the time during a debate so that people actually learn the most that they can about these individuals. If you posit that it is better to have a visual component, not just listen to these on radio or read the transcripts in a newspaper or other form of written material, then the visual comes along for the ride. And there is no question there are some people that are more comfortable with the medium than others. Witness 96, where you had the incumbent, Mr. Clinton, was very comfortable on TV. Senator Dole, one generation older, not so comfortable, still had memories of his debate in 1976 when he was Mr. Ford's vice president. It did not go so well. So there you had a generational difference in terms of the ease of the people on the stage. That's somewhat built into this. There will always be people that seem more fluid with it and more adept, and others that don't. So the question is are these forums valuable enough to enough people that in fact they should be continued in some form that includes the visual? It may or may not surprise people here to think about the numbers, but the normal TV newscast now on any one of the major networks is pulling somewhere in the 5 to 6 to 7 million range. That's on a healthy night. I think we could agree. A bad debate is 36 million. A good debate is 75 million, and that's only domestic. We figure that the audience for the first debate in 2016 internationally was roughly 150 million. That includes TV and online. So the audience for debates is larger than for any other kind of political programming. It's actually larger than for anything other than World Cup, Super Bowl, some events like that, but way bigger than conventions or anything else. These are the only opportunity where people get a chance to see the leading presidential candidates side by side, sometimes side by side, in the same situation with no advisors, no props, no pre-produced pieces that get inserted, no commercial interruptions. Ours run for 90 minutes straight through. So the question is, do people find them helpful? And the answer is, when you're looking at viewership like that, and you're looking at exit poll data that for many, many elections has said that more people base their votes on the debates than any other single factor. That's not to say they change minds. That is to say that that's how people evaluate them. Then I think there is some piece of this that people clearly find helpful and informative. If they don't, and when they don't, then needless to say, we should try something else. Or as Curtis's students examined, should we do it at all? Have they outlived their usefulness, or is there a better way to learn this same set of of information about the leading candidates.
Tom, you covered a lot of these debates. What's your view?
The funny thing about Curtis and me is we were present when the cycle began again after Kennedy and Nixon in '76 and all the way forward. And then we blew 2 years of our life researching the 1960 campaign, which of course included the first modern ones. And the numbers are just too high, Charles, to be ignored. I mean, Janet can produce anywhere from 50 to 100 million people for 4 evenings in a general election. You can't argue with those numbers, and I don't think anybody seriously does. The other thing about television, you know, Curtis and I are part of the generation that adapted to the existence of television after World War II. And one of the things we learned, I think, is that the video is an inescapable handmaiden of leadership in modern America. You kind of, I mean, you're not waiting for some quill pen statement to come from your leaders in government. You demand, rightfully, some more immediate contact. And to help legitimize a decision about who should be president, having 4 evenings like this is tremendously valuable. And later on, it's an important component in a president's ability to lead the country. One of Janet's helpers, advisors, in a couple of the ones at the turn of the century, he's passed away since, but Professor Richard Neustadt of Harvard, easily the most important scholar of the presidency in modern times anyway, had the view that there is no weaker office in democracy than the President of the United States, and that the ability to persuade is at the core of whatever power a president has, apart from blowing up the world. And therefore, you want to have at least an opportunity to see him take batting practice and fielding practice to make your decision, feel more comfortable about your decision. And I think that's why I've been trying to think of, if I were Trump, how would I attack you? I can't think of a name to call you. But if I were, and he can obviously argue that his abysmal performance in those 3 debates with Mrs. Clinton had no impact on how he did in the actual election. But unless somebody comes up with something, they're here to stay, and they should be.
Tom, I think the magic of the debates, and Janet can correct me if I'm wrong, is your description of Trump's abysmal performance is in the eye of the beholder.
Well, yes, but
many people,
the research goes on to affirm that. And I don't think performance has anything to do with performance in the election. One of the things that Curtis and I discovered going back over 1960 is that, yeah, Nixon looked like he'd been sleeping on the street for a week before the first one, okay? But there was actually polling done the day after each of the 4 debates that had never been looked at before. And it turned out that while the public agreed that Kennedy was far more effective and better looking in that first debate, it had absolutely no impact whatsoever on the horse race. This thing was a razor-thin election going into the first debate. It was a razor-thin election coming out of it. They helped. They were very interesting. But to say they were dispositive is just wrong. And often Janet's programs are illustrative, not dispositive. She'd take that, right?
Oh, yeah, no question.
Yeah.
well, not knowing what either one of those words means, I'm going to ask a different question.
Tom,
Typical sly editor's trick.
Tom went to Harvard. Charles and I are Ole Miss boys.
Yeah, Robert, they didn't talk about dispositive and illustrative in the undergraduate courses I had. But Janet, I know that the negotiation with the candidates continues to be crucial. And although the debates seem to be locked into our system as must do, you still depend on those candidates and the candidates' people agreeing with one another. Tell us, give us some inside skinny on interesting negotiating moments.
I'm happy to say that when we started, everything was negotiated. There were just endless, painful conversations. And in the last 2 days, there's been no disagreement on anything. You obviously want to be able to talk to the candidates' staffs about things that are small, that matter, and that have to do with making sure things are right and comfortable and dignified and respectful of the candidates. But we were talking in class today about how sometimes there are negotiations over substance, and sometimes the negotiations are simply to get in the heads of your competitor. And one of the examples from some years ago was one campaign staff was a little more seasoned than the other, and we were sitting in a conference room with my co-chairs and the chairman of both campaigns and senior staff, and at some point one campaign staff said, well, we would like the temperature on our side of the stage to be at 62 degrees, not at 68, which is what it was going to be. Now, remember, the podiums are 8 feet apart. I was trying really hard just to keep writing notes and to not look up, because what happened, of course, is that the other campaign is they are getting completely buffaloed by this, and they're going, 62? And they have it 62 over there, and ours is 67. Do we want 68? I didn't know they could do 62. How do they do that? Do they have a little air conditioner in the podium? How does that work? And you could see the guys that had posited it just chortling to themselves. They had done exactly what they wanted to, which was to get in the heads of the other guys, who then, of course, every time they asked for something, were going, where's the hook here? I'm happy to say that now that's at an absolute minimum. It's really important that all of these come together in a way that treats everybody fairly, and where you would never come away from a debate thinking, you know, he looked better than his opponent, or anything that seemed unfair. The highest wire act we've ever had was right here, and that was after we had gotten agreement by both campaigns that Senator McCain on a Tuesday, I think it was, said, I'm suspending my campaign, I'm going to Washington, and I'm going to go to the White House and discuss the financial crisis. The debate here at Ole Miss was on that Friday, and there was complete and utter uncertainty about what that meant about the debate, because as best everyone could tell, suspend meant the debate as well as the campaign. And Chancellor Kayat, Governor Barber, the team here never blinked. As painful, as excruciating, as attenuated as it was, Friday rolled around, and I will never forget, as some of the people up here have heard, that it was 8:30 on a day just like today, 8:30 in the morning, beautiful day, and I was standing in front of the Ford Center on the traffic circle, and Andy Mullins comes wheeling around at 1,000,000 miles an hour in a golf cart with Chancellor Kayat, who gets out of the golf cart and looks down at me and says, darling, do we have a plan B? And I said, no, sir. No, sir. We are going to have a debate here tonight. And he said, okay. He gets in the golf cart, and he and Andy roll away. And I turned to my husband, who was about 10 feet behind me, and I said a whole bunch of things I will not say this evening. This is a family show. We did not know until 10:30 that morning, through our lead Secret Service agent, who called me and said, we just heard from our counterparts at Reagan National, it's wheels up for the McCain campaign. It won't surprise you that somebody from Tupelo actually had already figured it all out, because they knew somebody who'd already been called to clean out the ambulance that was going to go to the airport, and you know the way Mississippi works. But that was the closest call we've ever had, and everybody here was graceful under an incredibly awkward set of circumstances.
A question.
Question.
Has a candidate ever broken an agreement negotiated ahead of time? In a debate?
No, not that I can think of. There have been inquiries ahead of time that would have let you believe that someone wanted to break the rules, and they would have done it by having a handheld microphone that meant they could leave their podium and wander around when the agreement had been that the candidates would stay at a podium. So you need to stay on your toes, and one of the things we do, which is a big help, is whenever you have a conversation about something to do with the format, the timing, the rules, you have it with both campaigns. You don't have a conversation that the other one could think, I think there may be game playing here. Tom wrote a column on the commission in 2000 when things were, there have been efforts over the years that have been very serious, like the McCain effort, to try to reduce the number of debates, dodge the debates, do talk shows instead of the debates. And interestingly, the public outcry is very quick and very negative. People see these as unlike anything else, and they don't want talk shows, they don't want one-on-one interviews. But he said something I've always thought was a huge compliment to the commission, and that is that we said the same thing in private that we did in public. There was never a hidden agenda as opposed to the public agenda. I think Chancellor Kayat would agree that you've got to play this straight. A university becomes a partner to the non-partisan debate commission, and it needs to be seen as something that is done fair, honestly, and without any kind of hidden hijinks.
What about reporters? I heard a story about the famous Dan Quayle, Lloyd Benson night, and that going into it, that was a panel of reporters that night, and going into it, the reporters had at least been urged or told that no follow-up questions. In other words, you ask your question, and then the next person asks his question, and so on and so on. And as the debate got started, someone asked Quayle about his background and experience and readiness to become president. And the feeling on the panel was that Quayle was fudging the answer and dodging the question a little bit. Not illegal, but that he was doing that. And often when that happens, reporters will gang up on the poor slob who doesn't realize what he's doing. So the next reporter asked a slightly altered version of the same question. And again, Quayle started fudging and hemming and hawing. So the next reporter asked it again. And this time, Quayle got a little pussy. And that's when he said, I've had almost as much experience as Jack Kennedy had at this point. And that was the line Lloyd Benson was waiting for, and he pounced. So we are hard to herd, which is another reason not to have reporters' panels.
That was an unusual example. The no follow-up agreement was that once you asked your question, then it was Curtis's turn, that you couldn't say, I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
But what's unusual in that VP debate is that all of those reporters realized there had been no answer, and so they just instinctively thought, no, we're going to stick with this and just keep going. But there's a classic example for why it's actually better to have a single moderator, because a single moderator can do away with what the next question is and just say, oh my gosh, that answer or non-answer just begs for a follow-up. And so you can follow up on your own question, and you don't need to worry about stepping on someone else.
And the record would show that Jim followed up on more than one occasion.
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Janet, let's go back to the Ole Miss debate. I think the average person who was familiar with what was going on thought, well, if McCain doesn't show, there'll be some sort of debate, an empty chair or something. And that wasn't the case at all. What are the rules about that, and why couldn't there have been some sort of alternative program?
That was a painful part of what we were trying to do here, was to figure out, okay, if we had to move the debate by a day or 2 days, could we do that? And at some point, the question was raised, well, Mr. Obama was here. And if Mr. McCain did not come, could Mr. Obama take the stage in the Ford Center and there could just be an interview of him? And the answer is, we have to answer to the Federal Election Commission and to the IRS as a 501c3. The FEC defines a debate as at least 2 people. So we had to deliver the unhappy news to the chancellor and his team that if that were the way things developed, the one-on-one interview could not take place in the Ford Center with our equipment, that it would have to take place somewhere else, or we'd have to pull the equipment, because that does not constitute a debate. It may interest you that, to know that a part of what we do, the Federal Election Commission only has 2 rules that pertain to debate sponsors. One is that you either have to be a nonprofit, which is what we are, or a media organization, like a newspaper or a TV station. In either case, you have to have pre-published objective criteria to decide who will be included in the debate. Ours, for the last several cycles, have been, in addition to constitutional eligibility and appearing on enough state ballots to have a chance of winning the Electoral College, that an individual meet a 15% threshold of support as measured a few weeks before the first debate by taking 5 national opinion polls, big ones, and averaging them. And most people, when they think about who is running for president, is not aware of the fact that in 16, anyway, there were more than 1,700 people who registered with the Federal Election Commission as presidential candidates. And you've heard of maybe 6 or 7 of them. It won't surprise you that all of them, understandably, believe that if they were on a debate stage, that they would get more funding, more support, more recognition, and that in fact that would be a good thing for the conversation. So this is a very complicated part of what we do. We reapply our criteria between each debate so that if someone moved in the polls, we would recognize that. And the criteria are applied to the major party nominees as well. They're applied to anyone who appears on at least one state ballot.
We almost didn't have Senator McCain participate. Can you foresee in your lifetime a major party candidate not participating in these debates?
I think now, Charles, you'd have to have a national security crisis or equal. I think it would be very hard, and we've seen several years where people actually made a good push to see if they could get out of them or at least reduce them, and it has not been successful. There is now, as there was with Mr. McCain, a deep suspicion as to why somebody can't find it possible to put aside 90 minutes on 3 different evenings and debate. But you guys would have equally informed opinions, probably more than mine, on whether that could happen now.
So actually, I have just a question in a way. It's a leading question, but isn't it true that you guys do pretty detailed research, both polling and focus group, after each election to look back at the debates, that you do research?
On format?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
And that especially in the beginning, you're dealing with numbers, approaching 60, 70, 80 million households. A view in the public that they're not your debates, they're
No,
their debates.
They're the public's debates.
And that there's a sense of ownership that's taken hold over the last 30 years that is pretty dangerous to play with if you're a presidential nominee.
These are, in
Like
fact,
George Bush and the chicken is what I'm thinking.
George Bush and the chicken was 1992, and the Bush campaign did their best to delay the even talking about the debates, and it was sort of working until a very large chicken started showing up at all of the president's rallies, calling him Chicken George. And when that started to get more news coverage than the president's speeches, the Bush campaign finally decided to actually start talking turkey, if you will, about the debates. It was so late that they ended up agreeing to 4 debates in 8 days. Do not try this at home. And my wisest advisor, otherwise known as my husband, actually said that he thinks, which didn't occur to me at the time, when we were asked to do this, I was on the phone with the Bush and Clinton campaign managers who said, all right, we've reached agreement. We want 4 debates, that's 3 presidential, 1 vice presidential, in 8 days. And by the way, we won't do 2 of your sites for a variety of other reasons. And they said, so that's it. Take it or leave it. And I said, well, we'll take it, obviously. And I hung up, and our executive producer looked at me and said, we can't. And I said, we have no choice. And we did. And it is a guaranteed way to lose your sanity to do 4 debates in 8 days. But it was interesting that I didn't think about the fact, and I think that my spouse is right, that they probably assumed that we would say we can't. You can't do that. That's physically, technically, et cetera, that's pretty close to impossible. And that was pretty close to right. But we did it. And that was the series, as you all remember, that Mr. Perot was included. He met our criteria. And 4 debates in 8 days meant it was the equivalent of the mini-series of the week. It was the first year with town meeting. So every debate was a little bit different that year. And people tuned in enormous numbers. They assumed Mr. Perot was a one-issue candidate, and it turns out he had opinions on all sorts of different issues. And those were very, very lively debates. So they set viewing records up until that time.
In 2016, the Republicans had 12 primary debates, and the Democrats had 9. And then we got to the general election where you took over. Are we in a period where we might suffer from presidential debate fatigue?
I believe the answer is yes, and it's very troublesome when people get so used to those primary debates that that's what they think of when they anticipate ours, because I don't know how many of you saw any of those. Those were horrid. They were not debates. They were pep rallies. They were disrespectful in terms of the kinds of production elements that were used, where the audience got whipped into expressing sort of rude noises and remarks about different elements of the debate. Those are all run by an individual network or a combination of a network with a newspaper or an online entity. So they have commercial breaks, they have a ton of insignia on the set, and in some cases they actually have people go out and they whip up the audience ahead of time. They purposely try to get them engaged. You can't hear anything, you can't learn anything. Those are really entertainment, I would argue. There were too many of them. The format was very hard to have enough time for any candidate to say something that was substantive and uninterrupted. I hope those never take over people's feeling and vision of debates to the point where they basically say, and we don't want the ones in the general election either, because those are, they're bizarre. And as long as they are run by commercial entities that know that the person with the smallest amount of support will always accept those invitations, and then you can work your way up, because the people that have more support are not going to want to be seen as saying, no thanks, I won't be there. That will work to their disadvantage.
Do any of you have a suggestion on how to improve the primary debate?
Well, I was going to, Curtis, I think some of our wildest nights have been covering multiple candidate primary debates, right?
Yeah, and I agree with Janet, they're pretty horrid.
Yeah. Remember the guy who threw the rat in the...
Oh, that was in New Hampshire in
Tell us-
'72. A guy threw a rubber rat on the table where the other candidates were.
I have another question before I go to the audience. I know you'll have some good questions. There are lots of different things that you could try if you could get buy-in from the candidates, including letting there be a debate where the two candidates asked each other questions. Could that ever happen, and why are the candidates afraid to do that?
I would hope it would happen. It certainly could happen if you had candidates that decided they wanted to agree to that. And there have been senatorial and gubernatorial debates in Massachusetts where that essentially has happened.
And in the primaries. And they've usually failed, by the way, Charles, because it gets caught up in tactics. Say you have a two-man fight for a nomination, and one guy's or woman is the front runner, right? Well, if it comes to you to ask that person a question in a debate, you want to make him as boring and inconsequential as possible. So I would ask you, how would you change the 5th page of the Interior Department appropriations bill, right? And put everybody to sleep. And then I would, go on. So it's vulnerable to tactics, is I think the reason not to do it in a modern media age.
Mm-hmm. Good. Let's go to the audience now. It's a great opportunity for you to engage in this conversation. Yes, Campbell.
Janet, can you talk about some of the lengths that people have gone to convince you to hold debates at their places? How much campaigning is there to be chosen?
Endless. There are two big campaigns. One is to host a debate at their venue, and the other is, it won't surprise you that every 4 years, every journalist in Washington, D.C. Wants me to remember that they, in fact, have done a lot of television. Am I aware of that? And that, in fact, they have quite a lot of experience that would lend itself to moderating a debate. Just wanted to be sure we're aware of that. We've had some pretty wacky things come over the transom. One of them was a college that said that they would take their rather old gym. It's in New England, so they don't need this, but they said they would air condition the entire gym to the tune of $1 million if we would think about coming there. There are some creative solutions to why a venue would be the perfect place. The ones, to be honest, that I find more vexing are the ones where a site will trash another site in order to make you think that they're actually irresistible. And as Chancellor Kayat knows, Ole Miss probably got more of that trash talk than almost anywhere in 08 until I finally blew the whistle on the other outfit and said, why don't you worry about your proposal and I will worry about other proposals. It says it's no different than when you watch stuff going on a sporting field. It says a lot about people, how they handle their own proposal and others. We're actually not quite as dumb as we look. I mean, we can figure out whether a proposal is sound or whether it isn't. And if it's not, what a site needs to understand is it would be very unfair to the site to go there and try to wedge something in. As you all saw here, we're invasive. And we take up a lot of space and we make a mess, and you don't want to do this if it isn't something that fits with the ongoing mission of a university, which is to educate students. If we fit in, great. If we don't, it's fine.
Janet's too discreet to identify the opposition to Ole Miss, but I feel free to do so. And it was a group from New Orleans called Women Against the Storm. And they vilified Ole Miss, our history, the fact that we're a country town in North Mississippi, et cetera, and they were a great metropolis trying to recover from Katrina. It's a noble thing they were trying to do, et cetera, et cetera. It was really extraordinary, and most of it was fairly private. I think, I don't know how widely known it was nationally, but it was extraordinary, the trash talk that came out of New Orleans against Ole Miss.
Another element in it was the trash talk that never happened. I think in the history of the commission, Janet might agree, she's been really blessed by two partisan co-chairs who had no difficulty putting the country ahead of their party for necessary business in Fahrenkopf and Paul Kirk. And as the Ole Miss idea germinated, and Curtis and I know something about this, there was tremendous help behind the scenes from people like Paul Kirk, who, for those of you who don't know him, is as Kennedy gets. And of course, the Kennedy name is intimately associated with the history of this university. And Paul, with a little help from Edward Kennedy, began to put out the word politically that don't come at us about Ole Miss in 1962. Don't bring it up, because the reason this idea is such a good one is because it's a chance to demonstrate, to put that stupid thing to rest finally once and for all. So don't come to us with race stuff. It's not going to work. And I was struck throughout the entire period how little of that there was. And it didn't happen by accident.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, my name is Sirius Adams, and I'm a junior public policy major from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Thank you so much for coming. And I just wanted to know, what is the screening process for the audience? Because I know you may have a conversation with them saying, this is not your moment, this is a protest, and I'm sure they have to go through Secret Service and stuff. So what is that like with the conversation with the audience?
The optimal audience is about 900 people. The reason for an audience is that, in general, candidates would rather be speaking to people than to cameras with nobody in front of them. So we believe it's important, and certainly if we're going to come to a campus, you are not going to have the students not represented in the audience, if there's an audience at all. But you don't want a lot of people for all of the obvious reasons. Regardless of how many, the tickets are divided between the campaigns, however many campaigns there are, and the commission. And out of our allotment, the university gets as many as we can make available. And almost all universities for some years now have given all their tickets to their students. The chancellor or president, the board of directors, the donors, everybody else, all the VIPs go and watch somewhere else, probably in a viewing place with the students. The exhortations from the stage, from the co-chairman of the commission, and from me, and from the moderator are usually quite effective, that people, they hear you when you say, this isn't for you. This is for an audience of up to 120, 150 million people worldwide. And if you make noise, the moderator has to stop, and you're going to take time away from this discussion. So please don't do that. And I'm happy to say, with the exception of a couple of blips in '88, that last cycle was the only time that anybody has said boo, which is good, and that's as it should be. Right behind you? Yes, sir.
So the party nomination debates comes up at the curriculum commission, correct?
No,
Oh, it does?
no.
Okay. My question is, as a follow-up to that, in the audience, who decides who gets in the audience? And the second question is, how does the commission deal with the forum from debate to debate when it seems to be deteriorating?
When we give a chunk of tickets to a campaign, they are the ones who decide who comes. There are a few assumptions, namely that the immediate family of the candidate will be there and in the first row, so that the candidate is looking directly at their immediate family members or other close friends. And otherwise, it's up to them to decide who comes. Usually it is close friends, supporters. It's a small group of people, so it is not a lot. Decorum, we can do everything that we can vis-a-vis the audience. I like to remind people we don't pick the candidates. And what happens on this stage is up to the candidates. The moderator is in charge of a format that we have decided on, and that is the way the debate will be run in terms of the time and the topics and the protocol, questions and answers. But in terms of what any given candidate feels it's okay, acceptable to say, that is up to that individual. There are people that will come to us and say that they think that the moderator should have the ability to cut the mic of a candidate, particularly if they go on too long, or that there should be other ways to, if you will, sort of have a 5-second rule. I think all of our moderators would agree that that's a bad editorial intrusion by the moderator, and that, in fact, the American public can figure out what they make of what's going on the stage, what's being said, what's not being said, how a candidate is acting towards their competitors and towards the moderator. So that is up to the candidate.
Janet, what was your reaction when Trump invited to be his guest at one of the 2016 debates several women who were associated with accusations of sexual harassment, whatever, against Bill Clinton?
We did not know until, let's see, the debates all start at 9 o'clock Eastern. We were in St. Louis, so that started at 8 o'clock local time. And I think it was 5:30 p.m. that afternoon that we saw on CNN this press conference that was going on in Mr. Trump's hotel. That's the first that we knew of that press conference. And our concern was basically threefold. We were wondering whether they would come with his motorcade, and if so, would they be coming with the candidate into the hall, because anyone who comes into the hall needs to go through magnetometers. And so we were concerned as to how they were coming in, on the assumption they did not have tickets or credentials or hard Secret Service pins, which the senior staff for the candidates do. And then the second concern was he going to use his family seats for those individuals? And was the plan that they would cross at the same time that President Clinton did to go to his seat, so that there would be a photo of his crossing paths, not with Mr. Trump's family, but with these women? And Frank Fahrenkopf, my co-chair, basically got to work very quickly to make it clear to the campaign that those seats were to be used only for the family, and that if the campaign had other tickets that they hadn't used, it was up to them to use those for those guests if they wanted to, but that they were to be treated like any other people that came into the hall and not used. I mean, there's an example of getting in people's heads, is that had they been in those seats, that would have been in Mrs. Clinton's direct line of sight.
We had a question right here. Oh, okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir, we'll go with you again.
My question is, I'm just trying to kind of get my head around, that one debate where Hillary Clinton said that Donald Trump was stalking her on stage. It made her very uncomfortable. Was that addressed after the debate, and was that within the agreed protocol?
We talked about this at some length in class. I'm glad you raised it. I wish I had an overhead footage of that debate, which I don't, because then I could actually map this out. But I would invite you to think about the fact that town meeting, that's where this was, is basically theater in the round. And if you can picture a horseshoe that goes from, say, 8 o'clock to 4 o'clock, those are the town meeting participants. And then down at 6 o'clock, it was Martha Raddatz and Anderson Cooper at one table. Then in the middle, you had on the left-hand side, if you're looking at it from the moderator's table, you had a headquarters for Mr. Trump, a stool, a raised stool, and a writing platform, a pedestal for writing and for a water glass. And then on the right-hand side, you had one for Mrs. Clinton. And these positions, by the way, are determined by coin flip. So that's where they were. Now, in town meeting, unlike any other debate, the candidate can go wherever they want. And so what happened in that particular shot is that a person at 9 o'clock on the Horseshoe asked a question. Mrs. Clinton, with her handheld microphone, goes over to that person to address them. And at that point, in one of the camera shots, and we have a lot of cameras, we have more than the usual number of cameras, and it's up to the director for the network that is covering that debate which shot they're going to take. That's an editorial decision by a member of the White House television pool, not us. But there is a way to take that shot, as you can see, that has Mr. Trump right behind her. Now, that's his station. That's where he is. But the fact is, at some point, he stood up. And so at that point, he's standing behind her. Question raised in the class, good question. Was he aware that he was in that tight shot? Did he move so that he could, in fact, get closer and be more of the shot? Did it just happen or whatever? Some things in debates are purposeful. Some actually are not quite as purposeful as you might think. But I just would invite you, when you think about that question, I can't answer it definitively because a part of this goes back to what we were saying. To some people that was stalking, to other people that was, he was there. And unless he moved purposefully over towards her station, at some point he was going to be in that shot. I don't know the answer as to whether he did it purposefully. And therefore, I can't comment on whether she is justifiable in saying she felt stalked as opposed to the fact that town meeting is a looser format. So the geography of a debate set is what it is. It's a small space. And I think my favorite example of how it can be used is after the 96 town meeting, which was in a very small space at the University of San Diego. The candidates actually elected to have podiums as their stations. And I talked to a bunch of social studies teachers shortly after the debate, and one of them astutely said, why is it that every time there was a tight shot of Bill Clinton, you saw Bill Clinton, and every time there was a tight shot of Bob Dole, you saw Bill Clinton? And it's because Mr. Clinton, who in fact is very television savvy, in fact had moved over to the edge of his podium so that there's Bob Dole, and somehow you'd sort of go. And there's Bill Clinton.
Quickly go through the town meeting in Richmond in '92. Wasn't there something like that where Clinton was programmed to come off the stage, come down?
Yeah.
And President Bush, 41, was a little more awkward and reluctant to engage that way. Result, an important part of the interpretation of the theatrical side of the debate that resulted from a difference in personality.
Difference in personality and an unfamiliarity.
That's
Mr.
right.
Clinton had done a lot of town meetings in the round, and he was very happy with that format.
And
Mr.
that is
Bush,
the one where Poppy Bush went like this.
7 times.
Yeah.
Some of which were on camera, some were not.
What new things might we look forward to in the 2020 presidential debates?
We review format between, after every cycle to try to see how we can make it more modern, more interesting, leaner. There's the question, we talked about this today in class, does it help to have social media injected into the debate or wrapped around the debates? I don't know what to expect in 20 because right now, in terms of that kind of decision, it seems like a long way away. But basically, what we hope to do is hear from anybody who's got a good idea. One of the students today said that she had 2 really bad ideas, and so she advertised it right up front, and one of them was, in fact, a good idea. But I would invite people to think about it from the perspective of what's the point? Why do these at all? And if you're going to do them, do you try to make them everything, or do you try to make them something quite elegant and spare and simple? And that takes into account, you can't dictate what the candidates are going to do and how you're going to come away in terms of feeling that one did better or not. But I don't think gussying them up is necessarily the answer.
Janet, thank you for joining Tom and Curtis and me tonight. It's been a terrific conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.